An 81-year-old man, humiliated for asking a simple bowl of soup, finds unexpected kindness in a stranger, changing both their lives forever. The cafe was bustling that chilly afternoon, with the scent of coffee mingling with freshly baked bread. A bell jingled softly as Mr. Walter, an elderly man with hunched shoulders and a tired gait, stepped inside. His worn-out overcoat clung loosely to his thin frame, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cane. He hesitated by the entrance, scanning the crowded tables. The warmth of the place was a sharp contrast to the cold that had seeped into his bones outside. He wasn't looking for much, just a simple, warm bowl of soup to ease his hunger and the chill that seemed to have settled permanently into his aging body. After a moment, he shuffled toward the counter, his shoes scuffing softly against the tiled floor. The young server behind the counter barely glanced up as Mr. Walter approached. She was busy chatting with a group of customers and taking their order, laughing and joking as if the elderly man standing just feet away didn't exist. Mr. Walter waited patiently, his weathered face betraying no frustration, though his legs ached from standing. He wasn't one to demand attention. He'd lived through enough to know patience. When the server finally turned to him, her expression shifted. Irritation flashed across her face, quickly masked by a fake smile. "Yeah? What can I get you?" she asked, her voice edged with impatience. "A bowl of soup, please," Mr. Walter said softly, his voice steady but frail. She looked at him, then down at the register, and sighed dramatically. "Soup? That's it?" she asked loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Some heads turned, curious. Mr. Walter nodded, not catching the edge in her tone. "Yes, just a bowl of soup." She gave him a once-over, eyes lingering on his worn coat and the slight tremor in his hands. "That'll be $5, she said, crossing her arms. As Mr. Walter fumbled in his pockets for the crumpled bills, he felt the weight of the silence that had descended around him. He wasn't fast enough for the server's liking, and she rolled her eyes, tapping her fingers on the counter. "Hurry up, old man. People are waiting," she muttered under her breath, but loud enough for him to hear. The words stung, sharp like a slap, but Mr. Walter said nothing. He wasn't one to cause trouble. Finally, he placed the money on the counter. The server snatched it up without a word of thanks and handed him a flimsy receipt. "Take a seat. Someone will bring it over," she said, already turning her attention back to the group of young people behind him. As Mr. Walter shuffled to an empty table near the window, the hum of conversation returned. But now it was different, quieter, filled with whispers. He sat down slowly, placing his cane against the table, his back aching as he lowered himself into the chair. He stared out the window at the busy street, trying to block out the glances and murmurs from the other patrons. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into barely concealed laughter. "Look at him," one young woman snickered from a nearby table. "Does he even know where he is? I bet he hasn't had a decent meal in a week," her companion added, laughing as he flicked a glance at Mr. Walter. Mr. Walter's hands clenched on the table, the trembling in his fingers worsening. He tried to focus on the street outside, on anything but the cruel words floating around him. He wasn't unfamiliar with hardship, but it had been a long time since he'd felt this small, this vulnerable. His mind wandered, drifting back to days when respect had meant something, when a man's age was honored, not mocked. The laughter grew louder, and it felt like the whole cafe was closing in on him, suffocating. A group of teenagers, loud and carefree, entered the cafe, and one of them, barely out of his teens, spotted Mr. Walter. The young man nudged his friend, his voice dripping with disdain. "Hey, Grandpa, you need help finding your dentures?" More laughter erupted, and Mr. Walter flinched, his face burning with shame. He couldn't bring himself to respond. He wanted to stand up, to leave, but his legs felt weak beneath him. The warmth that had drawn him into the cafe now felt suffocating, oppressive. The server returned, placing the bowl of soup in front of him with a careless clatter that caused the liquid to slosh over the sides. "Here you go," she said, her tone dripping with indifference. She didn't wait for a thank you before she walked away, muttering something under her breath that Mr. Walter couldn't quite catch. He stared down at the bowl in front of him. It should have been comforting, a simple meal to warm his body, but all he could feel was the weight of the humiliation pressing down on him. His hands trembled as he picked up the spoon, his vision blurring slightly. The soup looked thin, unappetizing, but that didn't matter. His appetite had faded the moment he'd walked into the cafe. From across the room, a young couple whispered and pointed. "He's probably a beggar," the man said, his voice low but not low enough. "Look at those clothes. He can barely afford a bowl of soup." Mr. Walter felt the sting of their words like sharp jabs to his chest. He took a deep breath, willing himself to remain calm, but his heart ached in a way that had nothing to do with his age. He didn't expect much from the world anymore, just a little respect, a little kindness, but even that, it seemed, was too much to ask. He lowered his head, staring at the untouched bowl of soup. Every spoonful felt like it would choke him, a bitter reminder of the cruelty surrounding him. He thought about leaving, but his body was too tired, too defeated to move. As he sat there, the cafe seemed to shrink, the noise around him growing louder, harsher. Every laugh, every whisper felt like a personal attack, and for the first time in years, Mr. Walter felt truly alone. He had faced war, loss, and hardship, but this small moment, a bowl of soup in a room full of cruel strangers, felt like one of the heaviest burdens he had ever carried. The bell above the cafe door jingled again, and for a brief moment, it was the only sound Mr. Walter could hear above the chaos in his mind. He didn't look up, too ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. All he wanted was to disappear, to fade into the background and be forgotten. But then something unexpected happened. Mr. Walter sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the cold soup in front of him. He barely noticed the world around him anymore. The muffled chatter and the clinking of dishes blurred into a meaningless hum, as if the room itself was trying to drown out his existence. The humiliation still weighed heavily on him, but there was something deeper, something much older, buried within the quiet man who had lived so many lives before this moment. His thoughts drifted away from the cafe, away from the laughter and the stares. They took him back to a time when the world had felt entirely different. He wasn't always this fragile, this invisible. In his youth, Mr. Walter had been strong, sturdy like the oak trees he used to climb as a boy. He had grown up in simpler times, in a small town where everyone knew each other, where respect was earned and given freely. But life, as it so often does, had not been kind to Mr. Walter. He had been through enough hardship to make any man's spirit break, yet he had endured. He remembered his youth, when war had torn him away from the safety of his home and thrust him into a foreign battlefield. He had been just a young man then, barely old enough to understand the weight of the rifle he was handed. The war had left its mark on him in ways no one could see, but he carried those scars every day. In those years, respect wasn't something to be demanded. It was something to be earned. Mr. Walter had earned it tenfold, fighting alongside men who, like him, had believed they were fighting for a better world. He had lost friends, comrades, men who had shared their last breath in the trenches, leaving behind nothing but memories that grew heavier with each passing year. He thought of Jack, his closest friend during the war. They had grown up together, two boys who had played in the same fields and then, by a twist of fate, fought side by side in the same trenches. Jack had been brave, braver than most, but bravery wasn't enough in the chaos of battle. Mr. Walter had held his friend as he breathed his last, a bullet wound cutting short a life that had barely begun. That memory had never left him, not after all these years. As he sat there in the cafe, the weight of those memories bore down on him. The cruelty he faced today paled in comparison to the horrors he had seen, but somehow it hurt just as much. His chest tightened, not from the cold air outside, but from the suffocating feeling of being forgotten, overlooked by the very people he had once fought for. No one in that cafe could see him for what he truly was, a man who had given everything, who had lived through a lifetime of sacrifice. To them, he was just an old man, an inconvenience, a joke. And that, more than anything, was what hurt him the most. His hands trembled as he gripped the spoon, not from weakness, but from the weight of the years that had passed him by. There had been a time when his hands were steady, capable, and strong, when they had built homes, cradled newborns, and wiped away the tears of those he loved. But now they trembled as if they were no longer his own. It wasn't just the war that had taken its toll on him. After the war, he had returned home to a world that had changed. The streets he had known so well felt foreign. The people, though familiar, were different. They didn't speak of the war, didn't ask about the friends who hadn't made it back. They just carried on as if nothing had happened. And so Mr. Walter had carried on too. He had found work, married, and raised a family. But life, relentless as it was, had more hardships in store for him. His wife, Evelyn, had been the love of his life, a light in the darkness of his post-war world. But illness had taken her from him too soon. He had watched as she withered away, powerless to save her, just as he had been powerless to save Jack all those years ago. Her death had left him hollow, but he couldn't afford to fall apart. There were children to raise, bills to pay, and life to continue. He had done what needed to be done, no matter how much it hurt. His children, grown now with families of their own, had scattered across the country. Visits became phone calls, and phone calls became rare. Now, in his old age, Mr. Walter lived alone in a small apartment, his days spent in quiet solitude. The world had moved on, but Mr. Walter remained. His body grew weaker, his mind slower, but his spirit, his heart, was still strong, still filled with the same love and strength that had carried him through all those years. And yet here he was, in a crowded cafe, treated like a burden. To these people, he was just another old man taking up space, another mouth to feed. They couldn't know the battles he had fought, the losses he had suffered. All they saw was frailty. All they saw was weakness. The laughter in the cafe grew louder, and Mr. Walter felt the sting of it deep in his chest. It was like the war all over again, people turning a blind eye, pretending not to see the pain that was right in front of them. The cruelty of strangers was something he had never gotten used to, no matter how many times he had faced it. As he sat there, staring at the untouched bowl of soup, a tear slipped down his cheek, surprising even him. He quickly wiped it away, not wanting to give the onlookers the satisfaction of seeing his pain. But the tear wasn't just for the humiliation he felt in this moment. It was for everything. For the friends he had lost, for the wife who had died too soon, for the children who had grown distant, for the life that had slipped through his fingers, piece by piece. He thought about leaving, but where would he go? The apartment was empty, cold. The silence there was even worse than the whispers here. At least in this cafe, he could pretend for a moment that he was part of the world, no matter how cruel that world had become. But just as the weight of it all threatened to crush him, something stirred within Mr. Walter. He had been through worse. He had survived war, loss, and loneliness. He wasn't about to let a room full of strangers take away his dignity. Not now. Not ever. His hands stopped trembling. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted the spoon to his mouth and took a small sip of the soup. It was cold, flavorless, but it didn't matter. He would not let them break him. Mr. Walter sat a little straighter in his chair, his chin lifting slightly as he stared out the window. He had faced far greater challenges in his life than a few cruel words. And though his body had grown old and frail, his spirit remained unbroken. He was still Walter Matheson, a man who had lived, fought, and loved with everything he had. And he would not be reduced to a punchline. Not today. As Mr. Walter sat in the cafe, surrounded by laughter that felt like daggers, something shifted in the atmosphere. The noise of the room faded as he continued to stir the cold soup, lost in a swirl of memories and emotions. Just as he began to accept the harsh reality of his solitude, a voice cut through the clamor, soft yet commanding. "Excuse me, sir." Startled, Mr. Walter looked up to see a young woman standing at his table. Her hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her eyes sparkled with a mix of concern and warmth. She looked no older than 25, but there was a maturity in her demeanor that suggested she had seen more than her share of life's struggles. "May I join you?" she asked, her voice gentle. Mr. Walter hesitated, caught off guard by the unexpected kindness. In a world where he felt invisible, the idea of someone wanting to sit with him was both surprising and heartwarming. Yes, of course," he managed to say, motioning to the empty chair across from him. As she settled in, he studied her face, looking for signs of judgment or disdain, but found none. Instead, she offered him a smile that seemed to light up the gloom of the cafe. I couldn't help but notice you sitting alone, she continued. I'm Lily. Walter, he replied, the name feeling heavy on his tongue. It had been a long time since he introduced himself to anyone. What brings you here today? She asked, her gaze flicking to the bowl of cold soup in front of him. Just lunch, he replied, feeling the weight of the unspoken humiliation lingering in the air. Thought I'd try this place. Lily nodded, and for a moment, an uncomfortable silence settled between them, but she didn't seem deterred. I think it's brave of you to come out alone, she said, her sincerity palpable. A lot of people would shy away from it. Mr. Walter felt a blush creeping up his neck, surprised that someone would think of him as brave. He was just an old man trying to navigate a world that had moved on without him. It's nothing really, he muttered, shifting in his seat. No, really, she insisted. A lot of people wouldn't even have the courage to sit in a crowded cafe alone. I admire that. He looked into her eyes, searching for the punchline hidden in her compliment, but there was none. Instead, he saw genuine warmth and kindness, a stark contrast to the coldness he had felt just moments before. It made him uncomfortable. What about you? He asked, desperate to shift the focus off himself. Do you come here often? Lily laughed softly, a sound that felt like music in the otherwise tense atmosphere. Not really, I just moved to town and was exploring the area. I thought I'd grab a bite to eat and maybe do some writing. She pulled a notebook out of her bag, the pages filled with a whirlwind of notes, sketches, and scribbles. What do you write about? He inquired, genuinely interested. Life, she replied simply. People's stories. I believe everyone has a story worth telling. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke, and Mr. Walter couldn't help but be drawn in by her passion. What about you, Walter? What's your story? He hesitated, the weight of his past looming over him. No one had asked him that question in years. My story? He began, his voice wavering. It's nothing special, just life. I fought in the war, lost people close to me, tried to build a family, and now, here I am. There was a pause as the words hung in the air, but instead of rushing to fill the silence, Lily listened. Her gaze was steady, encouraging him to continue. I lost my wife a few years ago, he added, the heaviness in his heart palpable. We had a good life, but life doesn't always go as planned. He felt his voice choke as he spoke about Evelyn. I guess I've just been trying to find my place again. Lily's expression softened, and she reached across the table, placing her hand over his. The simple gesture sent a jolt of warmth through him. I'm so sorry for your loss, Walter. That's incredibly brave of you to share. He looked down at their hands, the contrast between her youthful skin and his weathered hands striking. It's just the way things are, he said, trying to brush off the intensity of the moment. You get used to it. Maybe, she replied, but it doesn't mean it's easy. Losing someone is hard, and it changes everything. I can only imagine what you must be feeling. At that moment, Mr. Walter felt something stir inside him, a flicker of hope that he had long since extinguished. Here was a young woman, a stranger, reaching out to him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It felt strange and wonderful all at once. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're welcome, she replied, her smile brightening the room. You know, I often write about kindness and how small acts can change someone's day. I think what you've shared is a reminder of that. Their conversation flowed like a gentle river, winding through stories of life, loss, and resilience. They talked about the things that made them laugh and the moments that brought tears to their eyes. Mr. Walter discovered that Lily was an aspiring writer, passionate about sharing the stories of the overlooked and forgotten. Sometimes, she said, I think we're all just looking for connection. We're all trying to navigate this world in our own way. You might be surprised at how many people feel just like you do. Mr. Walter felt his heart swell as he listened to her words. You're right, he said, but it's easy to feel invisible when you're older. People often forget that we have stories too, that we've lived and loved. Exactly, she exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. I think we need to change that narrative. Everyone's story deserves to be heard, especially those who have experienced so much. There's so much wisdom in your years, Walter. It's worth sharing. For the first time in a long while, Mr. Walter felt seen. The warmth of her presence ignited something deep within him, a flicker of purpose. He found himself sharing more than he had intended. Stories of his childhood, the innocence of youth, the joy of marriage, and the heartache of loss flowed from him like a long dormant river finally finding its way to the ocean. And as he spoke, he noticed the cafe around him began to fade into the background. The laughter and chatter transformed into a comforting melody, the clinking of dishes morphing into applause for the stories being shared. In this moment, the weight of his years didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a tapestry woven with the threads of experience, resilience, and hope. As their conversation deepened, Mr. Walter noticed the cafe staff beginning to change shifts. A waiter walked by, stopping abruptly as he caught sight of Lily sitting with Mr. Walter. "Hey, aren't you that writer who's been trending on social media?" he asked, his face lighting up with recognition. "I follow your blog." Lily blushed, a shy smile creeping onto her lips. "That's me, I guess," she replied, a touch of surprise in her voice. The waiter's eyes sparkled with admiration. "Your stories are amazing. You have a gift for capturing the essence of people's experiences." He glanced at Mr. Walter, who was now feeling a surge of pride. "And it looks like you're inspiring someone today." Suddenly, the attention shifted back to Mr. Walter, and he felt both humbled and elated. "Maybe I should write about you too," Lily said playfully, her tone light yet serious. "You have an incredible story, Walter. The world needs to know it." He chuckled, the warmth spreading through him. "I don't know if anyone would want to read about an old man like me." "Are you kidding?" she replied, her eyes shining. "You have so much to offer. Your experiences, your wisdom. Those are things people want to read about. You just have to share it." In that moment, the possibility of it all surged through him. Mr. Walter hadn't thought about sharing his story in years. Perhaps he could inspire others, remind them of the importance of kindness, resilience, and connection. Maybe his pain could help someone else find hope in their struggles. As they continued talking, Mr. Walter felt lighter. The world outside may have been harsh, but here, in this cafe, with this remarkable young woman, he felt a flicker of belonging. The unexpected kindness from a stranger had opened a door he thought had long been closed. Lily ordered a fresh bowl of soup, and when it arrived, she insisted on sharing it with Mr. Walter. "You have to try this," she said, as she scooped a spoonful and offered it to him with a smile. He accepted it, surprised at how the act made him feel, like he was part of something, like he mattered. The soup was warm and comforting, and he could taste the flavors that were once lost in the cold bowl in front of him. As they continued to share their meals and stories, the cafe around them transformed. No longer a place filled with laughter that stung, it became a haven of connection, where two souls found solace in each other's company. Mr. Walter realized that in a world so often overshadowed by indifference, unexpected kindness could create ripples of change. It was in this small act, in this simple moment of connection, that he began to rediscover the beauty of life. He knew that this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. With each word exchanged, with each shared laugh, the bond between them grew stronger. And in that cozy cafe, surrounded by the warmth of connection, Mr. Walter took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past begin to lift, if only for a moment. The unexpected kindness of a stranger had not only touched his heart, but reignited the flame of hope within him. Maybe it's time to start writing again, he thought, as he exchanged stories with Lily, feeling truly alive for the first time in years. As the afternoon sun streamed through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow over the bustling room, Mr. Walter felt a sense of renewal wash over him. The conversation with Lily had not only lifted his spirits, but had reignited a fire within him that he thought had long been extinguished. There was a lightness in his heart that he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer the forgotten man sitting alone at a table. He was a storyteller, a participant in life's grand narrative. But as the cafe's door swung open and the bell jingled, announcing new arrivals, the atmosphere began to shift once again. A group of young professionals entered, their laughter ringing out like music, yet somehow it felt discordant against the backdrop of Mr. Walter's newfound connection with Lily. Among them was a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper smile. He exuded confidence, his laughter booming across the cafe. As he spotted Mr. Walter and Lily, he approached their table with a swagger that made the older man instinctively shrink back. "Hey there, "What's this?" the man said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Is this your new friend, Walter? I didn't know you were into younger women." Mr. Walter's heart sank. The old insecurities crept back in, gnawing at the edges of the joy he had just found. The laughter from the young man's friends echoed in the background, their amusement palpable. Lily, however, remained unfazed. She looked up at the young man with a steady gaze, her composure a stark contrast to Mr. Walter's sudden tension. "And what's wrong with that?" she replied, her voice calm yet assertive. The man scoffed, clearly taken aback by her response. "Just saying it's a bit unusual, isn't it? I mean, look at him." He gestured dismissively at Mr. Walter, his expression a mix of mockery and arrogance. "Why is it unusual?" Lily countered, her voice rising slightly. "Just because he's older doesn't mean he doesn't deserve companionship or kindness." Mr. Walter could feel the heat rising in his cheeks as he listened to their exchange. He wanted to defend himself, to assert his worth, but the words stuck in his throat. The humiliation of the earlier incident crept back, darkening his mood. "Relax, it's just a joke," the young man said, laughing as he turned to his friends, who joined in, their laughter ringing through the cafe like an unwelcome intrusion. Lily's expression hardened, and she leaned forward. "No, it's not just a joke. You might think it's funny, but you're perpetuating a culture that belittles people for their age. It's not right." Mr. Walter glanced at her, surprised by her passionate defense. He could hardly remember the last time anyone stood up for him like this. But the weight of the moment was crushing. The young man raised an eyebrow, seemingly unbothered by her words. "What's your name again, sweetheart?" "Lily," she replied, her chin held high. "And you should really reconsider how you treat others. Kindness doesn't have an age limit." The tension in the air thickened, and Mr. Walter felt a surge of gratitude toward her, mixed with a lingering embarrassment. He wanted to reach out and thank her, but the noise in the cafe felt overwhelming. He could sense the eyes of the other patrons on them, caught in the drama unfolding at their table. But before he could collect his thoughts, the young man smirked and turned to his friends. "All right, let's get out of here. This place is filled with weirdos anyway." With that, he strode away, his friends in tow, leaving behind a trail of uncomfortable laughter. The cafe returned to its usual rhythm, but the remnants of their encounter lingered like a shadow. Mr. Walter sighed, the moment of connection he had felt with Lily now tainted by the harshness of the exchange. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," he said, trying to regain some semblance of composure. Lily smiled gently, her warmth washing over him. "You don't have to apologize for them. People like him thrive on belittling others. It says more about them than it does about you." "Thank you for standing up for me," he said, his voice low. "Most people wouldn't bother." "Of course," she replied, her eyes filled with empathy. "I believe everyone deserves respect, regardless of age. We've all faced our own struggles, and kindness is a choice we can all make." Mr. Walter nodded, feeling the strength of her words seep into him. It was a reminder that there were still people in the world willing to stand against injustice, even in small, everyday moments. As they resumed their conversation, the atmosphere shifted again, this time for the better. Lily shared her own experiences with judgment and prejudice, recounting times when she had been overlooked or dismissed because of her age or gender. Her stories echoed the struggles he faced, creating a bridge between their lives, their shared vulnerabilities weaving a bond stronger than mere companionship. "I once had an editor tell me my writing was too young to be taken seriously," she said, her voice filled with determination. "It made me question myself for a long time, but I realized that my voice is unique, and I shouldn't let anyone diminish it." Her words resonated with Mr. Walter. He had spent years battling the feeling of being forgotten, invisible to the world around him. "It's incredible how people can make us feel small," he said softly, "but finding someone who understands can make all the difference." Their connection deepened, transforming the cafe into a sanctuary where their experiences merged. The laughter and chatter of the other patrons faded into the background, becoming a comforting hum rather than a source of anxiety. And then, as if the universe was conspiring to reinforce their newfound bond, the cafe owner emerged from the kitchen. He was a portly man with a friendly demeanor, always quick to greet his customers with a smile. As he approached their table, Mr. Walter felt a flicker of nervousness. "Walter, my friend," the owner said, his voice booming with warmth. "I'm so glad to see you here again." Mr. Walter returned the smile, feeling a sense of familiarity wash over him. "Thank you. I've missed this place." "I've missed you," the owner replied, glancing at Lily. "And who is this lovely young lady?" "This is Lily," Mr. Walter introduced her, feeling a swell of pride. "She's a writer." "Ah, a writer. That's wonderful," the owner beamed. "We could always use more stories around here. You know, Walter has the best tales from his years in the service." Mr. Walter felt his heart race, a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. Here was someone celebrating him, lifting him up when he had almost forgotten how. "Really?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I'd love to hear more about them." The cafe owner nodded enthusiastically. "You should. Walter has stories that could fill volumes. Like the time he—" Before he could finish, Mr. Walter interjected. "Oh, you don't have to." "No, please," Lily urged, her excitement infectious. "I want to hear." The owner chuckled. "All right, just a small one. Walter once saved a man's life during a stormy night, single-handedly. He didn't even think twice." Mr. Walter felt the blush creeping back, but there was a spark of something new. Pride. It was nothing really, just what anyone would do. Lily leaned closer, her eyes sparkling. "I doubt that. You must have been incredibly brave." As the cafe owner began to recount the story, Mr. Walter listened, feeling the warmth of nostalgia enveloping him. The laughter and camaraderie that filled the cafe seemed to pulse with a new energy. In this moment, he realized how quickly a situation could shift from humiliation to connection, from loneliness to warmth. And with each laugh, each shared memory, the bonds of kindness and resilience strengthened. It was as if the cafe had transformed into a tapestry of stories, weaving together the lives of those who entered its doors. In that little cafe, Mr. Walter discovered that the world was still full of unexpected shifts, moments that could lift a person up, reminding them of their worth. It was a simple lesson, but one that had the power to change lives. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the cafe, Mr. Walter felt a sense of belonging that had eluded him for so long. He was no longer just an old man in a cafe. He was part of a story, one that was still being written. And in that moment, he embraced the shift with open arms, ready to share his life's journey and discover the beauty of connection. As days turned into weeks, Mr. Walter found himself returning to the cafe with a newfound eagerness. Each visit felt like a reunion, a return to a place where laughter mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the gentle clinking of cups. The cafe had become his sanctuary, a realm where age didn't dictate worth and kindness flourished in unexpected places. The moments spent with Lily were no longer just fleeting interactions, they evolved into something profound. Their conversations transcended the ordinary, diving into dreams, fears, and hopes. Mr. Walter spoke of his love for storytelling, sharing tales of his youth, of love lost and adventures taken. He regaled her with anecdotes from his time in the service, illuminating the moments that had shaped him into the man he was today. Lily, in turn, shared her aspirations as a writer, the challenges she faced in a world that often underestimated her due to her age and gender. "People think they know you based on your age, but they don't see the years of experience behind it," she said one afternoon, her eyes reflecting the light streaming through the window. "They judge before they know, but I want to change that." Mr. Walter nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "It's easy to forget the value of our stories as we grow older. I spent so long feeling invisible, but you've helped me remember that every life is rich with experiences." Their connection blossomed, infusing the cafe with an atmosphere of warmth. However, the past still lingered, casting a shadow that Mr. Walter couldn't shake completely. The humiliation from his encounter with the young man haunted him at times, a reminder of how quickly pride could be stripped away. But Lily's presence gradually became a soothing balm, allowing him to confront his insecurities. One chilly afternoon, as the cafe buzzed with its usual clientele, Mr. Walter noticed a small group huddled in the corner, engaged in an animated discussion. Their laughter was contagious, echoing through the room, but there was something unsettling about their tone. He could catch snippets of their conversation, mocking and ridiculing, the kind of banter that left a bitter taste. "Who does he think he is?" one voice sneered, accompanied by laughter. "An old man trying to fit in with a young crowd. Pathetic." Mr. Walter felt the familiar pang of embarrassment creep in. The sting of their words was sharp, cutting through the laughter of his own table. He glanced at Lily, who had caught the same remark. Her expression shifted from one of joy to concern, and for a moment they locked eyes, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "Don't let them get to you," she whispered, her voice low but firm. "They don't know what they're talking about." But he could feel the weight of their judgment settling on him, the fear of being seen as irrelevant rising again. "It's easy for them to say that," he replied quietly. "They haven't walked the path I have." Lily took a deep breath, leaning closer. "Exactly. They haven't lived your life. They don't know the sacrifices you've made, the lessons you've learned. Let's not give them power over us." Her words resonated within him, igniting a flicker of resolve. He realized that the power to define himself lay not in the opinions of others, but within the stories he chose to share. He didn't need to allow their negativity to shatter the bond he had built with Lily or the confidence he had started to reclaim. As the conversation shifted back to lighter topics, he felt a renewed sense of strength. Instead of shrinking back, he would rise up. That's when an idea sparked within him, one that could transform not just his experience, but potentially help others like him. The next day, with a sense of determination, Mr. Walter returned to the cafe. He carried a small notebook, one that had been gathering dust for far too long. It was a gift from his late wife, who had encouraged him to write down his thoughts, his stories. He had filled its pages with fragments of his life, but never had he shared them publicly. Lily was already seated at their usual table, her laptop open and fingers poised to type. She looked up, her face brightening at the sight of him. "You're back." "I am," he said, a smile breaking across his face. "And I have an idea." Her eyebrows shot up in curiosity. "I'm all ears." "I want to hold a storytelling session here," he announced, feeling the words electrify the air between them. "Not just for me, but for anyone who wants to share their stories." Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement. "That's incredible. What a great way to connect people. We can invite others from the cafe, maybe even create a flyer." As they brainstormed ideas for the storytelling session, Mr. Walter felt a surge of purpose. This was more than just a chance to share his experiences. It was an opportunity to create a space for others, to remind them that their voices mattered, regardless of their age or background. Word spread quickly through the cafe, the patrons intrigued by the idea of gathering to share their stories. The date was set for a week later, and as the day approached, Mr. Walter's excitement mingled with nervousness. Would anyone show up? Would they be willing to open up about their lives? The night before the event, he sat in his living room, surrounded by his old photographs, letters, and memorabilia. Each item was a piece of his journey, a testament to the life he had lived. He flipped through his notebook, filled with stories of courage, love, loss, and resilience. They were the threads of his existence, woven together to create a tapestry that was uniquely his. When the day finally arrived, the cafe buzzed with an air of anticipation. The tables were arranged in a circle, a cozy setting that felt inviting. Mr. Walter stood at the front, heart racing, as a small crowd began to gather. There were familiar faces and new ones alike, each person bringing their own experiences and stories to the table. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the fluttering in his chest. "Today we come together to celebrate our stories. Every one of them matters. Our lives are filled with moments that shape us, and by sharing we honor our journeys." He looked around the room, seeing a mix of curiosity and encouragement. Lily sat in the front row, beaming with pride, her support grounding him. One by one, people began to share their tales, some lighthearted, others deeply moving. A young woman spoke about overcoming her struggles with mental health, her words resonating with those who had faced similar battles. An elderly man recounted his experiences during the war, his voice trembling with emotion, but filled with pride. Each story was a thread that wove them together, creating an intricate fabric of shared humanity. As Mr. Walter listened, he felt the weight of his own insecurities begin to dissipate. He realized that vulnerability was a strength, not a weakness. The stories flowed, uniting everyone in a way he had never experienced before. It was a beautiful reminder that each person's journey, no matter how different, contained universal threads of hope, resilience, and love. When it was finally his turn to speak, Mr. Walter took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He shared his own stories, his childhood, his adventures, and the lessons learned along the way. He spoke of the times he had felt invisible, of the moments that had defined him, and of the kindness that had changed his perspective. "I spent too long believing that my worth was diminished by my age," he said, looking out at the audience. "But being here today has shown me that it's never too late to share your voice, to connect with others. Every story we tell is a testament to our resilience." The applause that followed felt like a wave of warmth washing over him. In that moment, Mr. Walter knew he had done something profound, not just for himself, but for everyone present. They had created a community where kindness flourished, where each voice was valued. After the session, as people mingled and shared more personal stories, Mr. Walter caught Lily's eye. She smiled at him, her expression one of pride and admiration. "You did it," she said, stepping closer. "You created a space for us all to connect and heal." "I couldn't have done it without your support," he replied, feeling a swell of gratitude. "You helped me see that our stories matter." As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Walter felt a shift within himself. The loneliness that had once consumed him was replaced by a sense of belonging, a realization that he was part of something greater. The cafe was no longer just a place to grab a meal. It had transformed into a sanctuary of stories, a haven for those seeking connection. And as he left that night, the weight of the world on his shoulders felt a little lighter. The life-changing moment had not just been the storytelling session, but the journey of rediscovering himself. A journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness and blossomed into a community united by the power of their voices. In the heart of that cafe, Mr. Walter found his purpose, and for the first time in a long while, he walked home with hope in his heart, ready to embrace the next chapter of his life. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of resilience, kindness, and the power of stories. If you enjoyed this tale, please like and subscribe for more inspiring narratives that touch the soul. Your support means the world.